Welcome to the Evanston Arts Center. I'm Paula Danoff. I'm the president of the Arts Center, and we are so thrilled that you're joining us here today to see the wonderful work that Mark Nelson has done. It's behind me, and you'll see other parts of the gallery space. And I'd like to introduce Mark Nelson at this time. Mark Nelson's work was forged by his childhood experiences overseas. Raised as a colonial American outside of the continental U.S., his international travels culminated in a nearly 20-year residency with the Republic of Panama, where he developed an interest in visual and performing arts. Nelson returns to the United States to finish his formal education in the 1980s at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, followed by an MFA at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Nelson's work can be found in private and public collections that includes a canvas mural at the U.S. Embassy collection in the Republic of Panama. Nelson also participated in several projects such as Cows on Parade and the Lighthouses on the Mag Mile. Mark Nelson has been a resident of Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood artist community in his Gringolandia studio for 22 years and a participant in the 18th Street Pilsen Open Studios program. We are so honored and thrilled to show you the work of Mark Nelson and also for you to meet the artist today. Thank you so much.
So the title Humanity Amorphic was generated by the idea that humanity itself, the ideal aspect of humanity, what we want it to be, seems to go through cycles through history where we're getting it to where it needs to be, and then suddenly the rug is pulled out from under us, or in another sense that humanity can often be gradually shaped into something that we don't recognize by a change in culture, a change in politics, or an ideology that has somehow overwhelmed our culture that we didn't see coming, or we did see coming and we didn't actually do anything about it. So I guess, if anything, it's sort of that plasticity of humanity and our ability to shape it in either direction, progressively or regressively, in the case of our current cultural status. The paintings themselves, I began working on them during the winter. Once it got cold and I went indoors, because I work outdoors as well as indoors, went inside my studio and I began assembling these as one giant fabric. So all these canvases were butted up together. The subject itself, I decided to go this route because of the constant information that was coming to us about the ongoings of border immigration, the caging, the incarceration of immigrants that were perhaps previously welcomed with open arms, as it says at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. However, it just had a sort of allegorical feel to the 1930s, where people were being channeled like cattle and contained like cattle, like livestock. And that brought in, really going back to this whole notion that this country, although the empire itself was built on slavery and the genocide of indigenous populations, that we had this ideal, we had this Constitution, this Declaration of Independence, we had these Bill of Rights that called for an ideal, a reckoning, a redemption of the past to work towards something that was more holistic and bringing everybody back together to create a healing. So these pieces were, although inspired by the bad immigration policies that we have currently on the border and the treatment of separation of people that were reminiscent of slavery and from our past. They also brought to mind the cataloging of human beings into different sectors, which sort of, I guess, pushed the division of human beings, particularly in our country, whether they were citizens or residents or here on a visa or undocumented. The idea that somehow one sector of society was better than the other. And that's not going to get us anywhere. I also did these paintings in quantity because I felt that one or two of the paintings would look more like tokenism or just a trivial sort of nod to the inhumane treatment of other human beings. So I felt that I had to do a lot of them to overwhelm the viewer when they came into the gallery space. While the tiles themselves were sort of inspired by these beach drawings that I had done in '09, I was thinking more about the sort of trivial offers of comfort these institutions, these incarcerating institutions use for their involuntary guests. So the color patterning of the towels, I almost went with sky blue, but it made me think of some of the older versions of that. You know, contemporary wise, everybody gets thrown like this sheet of mylar, right? Like to wrap themselves in as they lay in their cage. But I was thinking of some of the wrappings that were used like in the Holocaust, you know. And then the idea of numbering the torsos to represent the cataloging of humans as cattle. And I thought the chain could be much more to the point as an object of restriction or a material of restriction without obscuring the entire composition. Because a chain link fence, your focus might be obstructed by this constant patterning of the diamonds and the chain link fence. The barbed wire, your eyes might go to the sharpness of the barbs of the curled barbed wire. But the chain allows you to visually look past it, but at the same time react to it as sort of the first object in the foreground. So again, related more to the depth of field. You've got the chain link, then you have the torsos, then you have the blanket, then you have the ground itself, which is this sort of textured sand gravel-like surface. And then finally you have the blue geometric patterned background to the very end, farthest distance in the composition, with that floating symbol. The floating symbol, by the way, is used frequently in human trafficking. As far as like noting this is a reference to human trafficking. So this particular piece relates to the public's sudden, outrage at the status of Columbus statues in our current contemporary world and culture. Now in Central America, throughout the Americas and South America, people have been tearing down Columbus statues in their towns for decades. This is not new to Latin America, because they're the ones that took the first, hit from the the conquest and the things that followed, the doors that Columbus opened by accidentally coming to the Americas. There's also this irony about discovering other people's worlds. I mean, Columbus didn't discover America any more than Marco Polo discovered China, which was a thriving, huge empire that had actually traveled the world 1,000 years before Marco Polo had ever gotten there. And same for Columbus. People have been coming to the Americas for thousands of years from other points of the world, whether it's Asia coming to South America, or the Norsemen coming to Upper North America, or even an Irishman crossing from Ireland. An Irish priest, I believe, was to have crossed in a single boat. I mean, the idea of crossing the Americas by even further ancient civilizations is being currently explored by many people trying to understand these acropolises and cities that are currently underwater. They go back 12,000 years or older. So the idea of retaining or holding on to the Columbus mythology is important for certain cultures because that's what they were programmed for as part of our sense of being a U.S. American, a North American, our American identity. I mean, even if you think of some of the pioneers that tamed the Wild West, that controlled and moved all the indigenous people out of the way, fighting those savages, So that was Columbus is sort of the icon for that whole snowball effect that took place once the conquest took place in the Americas, and then how the English and the French moved westward, pushing through indigenous America and pushing people out of the way in the name of gold, land, any resource, lumber, mining, any resource that they could exploit and take advantage of. So this piece is sort of like an alternative proposal for a realistic and honest Columbus monument. Yes, let's celebrate Columbus, but let's be honest about it. The taking of the Caribbean islands, the genocide of those people, whether it was directly from smallpox and measles, knocking out 2/3 of the population, or the follow-up of, say, Columbus himself quoting in his own journal that any male that not providing him a hot peck of gold daily, any male 15 years and older that could not do that, could have the repercussions of being tied to a tree and having their hands cut off and left to bleed to death on that tree. Interesting little Christian reference there, being tied to a tree. They're all going to die like Jesus, right? So you have that reference to the barbacoa and the Tainos by the birds that are assembled on a single rod, barbacoa giving us the concept of barbecue. So there you see the sort of melted gold surrounding the treasure chest that's stained with the blood of this genocide. Now the extending hoses that come out that are siphoning from this sort of pre-Columbian pillaging of the Americas go directly to these architectural forms that are covered in numbers, the numbers representing the number of people that were exterminated either by disease or by the sword or by burning, And then you have blackbirds, which are excluded from these dwellings the openings of the dwellings are caged off, fenced off, and those represent the institution of African slavery, the African diaspora, the Middle Passage, and how the institution of slavery grew from this conquest and made its way into North America and became institutionalized by our government before the revolution and going into, all the way till the Emancipation Proclamation. There's also sort of a contemporary reference for myself that the architectural forms represent that continuation through the Section 8 housing that I encountered when I first came to Chicago in the mid-'80s, that basically just looked like slave quarters, like the Taylor homes or the homes that were all lining up in the area that now University of Illinois occupies along the south of the Eisenhower Expressway. But I got here in time to see all those dwellings still standing and a lot of the residents still living in the area of those compounds, or I guess contemporary slave quarters. At the very top of the construction, you'll see a tiny Statue of Liberty. And in that sense, I guess all this tragedy and all this exploitation and still, with all that happening, the idea that this population that has been taken advantage of, that has been sidelined, that has been not given the full American dream, still holds that ideal at the top of that mountain, that liberty is still achievable, that equity is still achievable. It's a very tiny, that also sort of emphasizes the perspective. By using a smaller image of the Statue of Liberty, it makes it seem further away. But at the same time, it's still there, and the vision is not gone, and the hope has not left, and the passion, the fire to attain it, hopefully for this current generation, will remain. The fire will remain lit, and the struggle will remain. For Latinos, it's referred to as La Raza, and of course, for the African American population, it is contemporized through Black Lives Matter, and yeah, I think that's the key. As the slogan goes, when Black Lives Matter, all lives will matter. Personally, I've had a lot of input in terms of being inspired. My initial inspiration had come from my upbringing, being a Navy brat. Both my parents were in the Navy, but my mom got out when I was born. They were both lieutenants. I think they met at the Officers Club on a submarine base in the state of Washington during the Korean conflict. So that those travels, those international travels, have definitely seen how different cultures operate, assimilating a lot of the cultures that we lived with as residents, and then of course ending up in the Republic of Panama and embracing that culture as sort of my second home, having lived there for almost 20 years. So definitely culture has been a big impact on how I see our own culture. And as far as teaching, I've always been fascinated, and I don't know whether it's just out of necessity or whether it's because I'm just curious, out of the way we learn. So it's a premise for me that when I go into a classroom, that everybody's learning differently. Now, if I think of my own experiences in studio painting as a student in the School of the Art Institute. You have a whole room full of different skills, the way people just, if you think about the way we sign or write our name, I don't know how people still write by hand, but if you look at at the handwriting of individuals, it's very unique, very different curves, different strokes. Some letters emphasis is down or up, but it tells us a lot about people by looking at their handwriting. And handwriting is probably one of the most basic forms of voice. How our voice is expressed visually. So if you go from handwriting to drawing, the idea that over time you can learn to refine your voice so that your voice is so unique, like a singer, that it's easy to create narratives. It's easier to have a dialogue because you have now developed your own language. And through that language, you can have a discussion about anything that you feel moved about. So going back to how we learn as students, it's sort of the same way about the input that we get as we evolve in the arts. So culture, watching my students learn and move their way through not just material, but the concepts of that material and how to translate an idea into a visual concrete form or even a temporary form like theater. I started these paintings during the winter before the quarantine kicked in. As the quarantine kicked in, it was turning spring. So the minute I have the weather in my favor, I tend to move everything outdoors. And I used the quarantine as a means to develop some tools that I had not previously had in my outdoor area outside of my building, my backyard. So the first thing I did was I considered acquiring one of these big, humongous Santa Fe style easels, with all the ropes and pulleys. And after pricing them, I realized, I have the ability to create this myself. So I had a lot of treated wood out back, and I basically the first project was building myself a giant easel that used big wooden pulleys and ropes, that you might see like hoisting a sail up on the mast on an old clipper ship. So that could handle a canvas that was on the average 6 feet by 9 feet. Then I built myself a rolling workbench that was about 10 feet across on big casters that I could pound and work on. And then I began bringing these paintings outside and working on finishing the oil paint aspect of them outdoors. And I do like for my paintings to be exposed to the sun. So that was a nice advantage. Even though it was still cold, they got a lot of sunlight to help cure them. And I use a lot of I use a lot of cadmiums, all those no-no paints that people try and stay away from nowadays. But outdoors, I'm quite comfortable with them and I'm very safe with them. But the color will hold better and is less likely to fade while I'm working outdoors. So I got a lot of that done. I also got I got a lot of work done during the quarantine. I think more so than I would normally get, because some of that outdoor time was broken up, like visiting my mother in her nursing home. So they were under quarantine, so I couldn't even visit my mother. Going to the gym every other day. Instead, I pedaled a stationary bicycle inside of my studio, and while I looked at the paintings. So yeah, I probably put in a lot more hours on my work because of the quarantine. I ended up producing a lot more work than I normally do. I like to pace myself out, and I like to work on 5 or 6 different projects simultaneously. And this allowed me to actually finish a lot of these projects that I was working on at the same time. If we're trying to unite this country, we gotta have a really informed public about people being manipulated. I just want to, if this is like, we're kind of closing up now, my brother and I, with the quarantine down on the nursing home, we started meeting up together with my mom at the nursing home. And he turned to me on one of the visits and he goes, do you know that, back in 78, when we're still in the canal zone, when my dad was still there, he took my brother to the local Air Force base and showed him the bodies. My brother was 16 at the time. I think he was 16. Showed him the bodies being taken off of the airplanes from Jim Jones' special event where 900 people were forced to or voluntarily kill themselves, drinking the poison Kool-Aid, the cyanide Kool-Aid. And my father didn't say anything as the body was coming off. He just had my brother stand with them, and then he pointed to them and said, "That's a cult. Remember this moment." Pretty much that's all he told him. That's a cult. So easily people are drawn into following somebody or something, some idea, when it's the only source of information they have to make a rational or irrational decision. I think that's the danger that we face today, is when people treat one source of information as their reliable, faithful avenue of reality. And we can't afford that. If we're, Benjamin Franklin only thought that the United States was going to last 50 years after they signed, those documents. And because of the fickleness of humans. I mean, if you think about Shakespeare's Mark Antony, the play, where Mark Antony gets up and he starts celebrating Brutus's, assassination with the centers of Caesar, and then slowly turns the speech to make Mark Antony makes Brutus into a villain, and the same crowd that was originally cheering Brutus as the conqueror and taking away, Caesar, ends up chasing Brutus out of town as the killer of the glorious Julius Caesar. So the crowd has always been fickle and vulnerable to the speaker. And that's why we need a team of diversity leading. And that's why we need a diverse array of resources for our information that people can draw from one at a time and come to a sort of unified agreement about something, rather than a fabricated agreement that can lead to bad things. I'm really pleased to be here at the Evanston Arts Center and showing my work, because it's really great, just like I was talking about news resources, it's really great to bring the work to different audiences to get a different feedback, or to have the same discussion with a variety of audiences to, if anything, maybe inspire somebody in that audience to have a dialogue about a similar subject through their own voice, be it music, writing, or visual arts. So I hope it inspires somebody to do something on their own.